In 1889, Copper King W.A. Clark and 74 other men wrote a state constitution to serve the needs of Montana's powerful interests, with a weak governor, a secretive legislature, and special tax deals for the powerful. After 60 years under the copper collar, Montana was declared the nearest thing to a colony of any American state. The Anaconda Mining Company even owned most Montana newspapers, the Copper Press. The corporate dominance of Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. 70 years after statehood, the Copper Press was finally sold, and thousands of World War II veterans had been educated under the GI Bill. Newly enlightened Montanans wanted out from under the copper collar, and big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Changing Montana's constitution was the top priority. Strengthening the governorship, opening up the legislature, empowering citizens. Voices of Montana women, totally silenced in 1889, rang out loud and clear for these changes. When the Constitutional Convention began, 19 women were among the elected delegates. And when the delegates came together in convention, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, men and women, young and old, sat alphabetically as equals, Montanans just wanting to make their state better. And so they did, producing a constitution for the ages, the last best constitution. Now, at its 50th anniversary, Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time shine a light on the creation of this remarkable Montana Constitution.
Welcome back to Last Best Constitution, our series of programs focusing on Montana's 1972 Constitution on its 50th anniversary. We're here in 2022. We celebrated in June the passage by the voters of the Constitution that was written earlier that year in the Constitutional Convention with 100 citizen delegates. Very notable because none of them could be holding public office if they were going to be a delegate. So you had truly a citizens' constitutional convention. And even though they ran on a partisan basis, they sat alphabetically in a nonpartisan approach to things, and it made a lot of difference in how things proceeded. The Constitution that we had in 1889, when we became a state, had held for 83 years. And during those 83 years, Montana chafed under the copper collar, as it was known, which was the essentially strong political and economic and cultural and social dominance of the powerful interests of the time, which was the Anaconda Company ultimately, and large stock growing efforts in eastern Montana. And the document that was written in 1889 was written for the powerful by the powerful. There were no women in the Constitutional Convention of 1889. They couldn't vote even then, right? So what do we have? We have an all-men, powerful interest constitution that had a lot in it that protected the interest of the powerful. And one of the things that was a product of that convention in 1889 was a weak government. The executive branch, the governor was weak. Most boards and bureaus and commissions were running things. The governor wasn't. The legislative branch was very secretive. A lot of private things. Decisions were made in the dark. The judiciary was a little bit more responsive, but it was still, because of the nature of it, dominated by the governor's appointments, which were made by governors who were very subservient often to the powerful interests of the time. So a strong government serves the people sometimes, but it doesn't often serve the needs of the powerful, who don't really need a strong government. So we suffered under the copper collar for 83 years. And there was a rising up, a passion for change that came after World War II, when the Montanans had gone to the war, had seen other places. They came back and they had a GI Bill They got educated, started being inquisitive about things. Women were becoming more and more empowered, not only with the vote, but by taking part in government. The League of Women Voters, Association of University Women, other women's groups. There was a passion for change that was going on. Our copper press, which was owned by the Anaconda Company, all the daily newspapers in the state were owned by the Anaconda Company, except for the Great Falls Tribune. But in 1959, they sold their newspapers. And when they did that, we had new investigative reporters, and they began to shine a light on what was going on in Montana's government. And what they shined the light on wasn't very pretty. And so Montanans got excited. Winds of change blew across the Treasure State, and we had the people say, by 65%, we want to have a constitutional convention. We want to have a chance to have a new basic document to structure our government and to give a sense of direction for the future of our state. And that's what we're talking about here now in this series. And we take up each article, and we take up the key people who worked on it. As they were just regular Montanans going to work, trying to make a change and trying to make a difference. So today we have a real special guest, and that's Karen Beck Caplis. Karen and I met 53 years ago, we hate to say, but we both were staff members of Governor Forrest Anderson's Executive Reorganization Commission. And we'll get into that a little bit because it did affect the executive branch of the Constitution as it was developed. But when we met in 1969, you were coming from the University of Montana coming from Turner, wasn't it?
Hoagland.
Hoagland.
Yeah,
Hoagland.
please.
Okay, don't say Turner. Okay, Hoagland. And tell us about your background and your educational background, your family background, because we like people to know who they're listening to.
Okay, well, Hoagland Turner area, we call it the Big Flat, is north of Harlem. Farming communities.
Yeah, that's Blaine County. It's east of Havre, right?
Northeast of Havre.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we were a farming family. At that time there were two schools, one in Turner and one in Hoagland. I graduated from Hoagland High.
How big was the class? The graduating class?
My graduating class was 3 people. There were, I think it was when I was a freshman, there were 14 students in the 4 grades, 7 boys and 7 girls. It was crazy. It was really, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, graduated there. Most of it, not too many people went on to college, I don't think, from there. I went several places to school. I started out at PLU, Pacific Lutheran in Tacoma. Did, I think, 4 quarters at Northern Montana, which was in Havre, and then transferred to the University of Montana. I think that's what it was called still, but it was in Missoula. At some point in time, they changed the names.
It used to be Montana State University.
Right, yeah. So I got a BA in political science and history in December, I think it was, of 1967. And Ellis Waldron was my advisor.
Who was deeply involved in the constitutional processes.
Right. He was a member of one of the preparatory commissions.
The Reform Commission.
Right.
Yes, yeah.
And he'd written several articles and done a lot of work on constitutional revision. And then I think, well, it was in '67, I participated in the pilot program for legislative interns. Wow. And interestingly enough, when as the session was winding down, I went and talked to the head of the Legislative Council, the executive director, and said, what can I do with a BA in political science and history? And he said, not much.
Was that Gene Tidball?
No, it was Sorty.
Okay.
Yeah. And so here I am, about to graduate, didn't have many prospects for a job.
We used to say with a degree like that and 25 cents or 10 cents, you'd get a cup of coffee.
Right, exactly, exactly. So over the summer, I took some courses in education, and I didn't think I was prepared for teaching, but I was set up to.
What summer was that?
67.
Summer of 67.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. So I was supposed to do some practice teaching in Helena in the junior high, and I just didn't think I was prepared. So at that time, a graduate assistantship came up, and I think this is correct, in the political science department.
Uh-huh.
And I applied for that and got it. And I was working with Waldron, as well as some of the other
So
profs there.
67, 68, you were working for.
Right, and went to, so I did not do my practice teaching.
Right.
I was then the graduate assistant until I came over here for executive reorganization.
You know, it's interesting because I moved there in August of '67 to go to graduate school.
Oh, really?
In political science.
I'll be darned.
And
so maybe we met before.
Yeah,
you just didn't know.
Yeah, and so when I discovered everything was going great, but we had a child and needed a little bit more, and I decided I needed to have a paycheck. So I quickly took my education courses,
Same thing, yeah.
and bam, out I went, and guess where I ended up? Helena Junior High School.
Oh, maybe you got my job.
For 1 year.
Yeah,
but yeah.
Well,
and
good
then
for you.
Suddenly I was at reorganization. And, so you tell us about reorganization then after that for you.
Well,
we spent from 69 to 71 in reorg, doing executive reorg, and
Right.
part of 71 doing that implementation.
Well, my assignments were, strangely enough, with my background, agriculture and livestock. So I did a lot of interviewing of the staff members in the two departments, and reading of the executive reorganization proposals that had been that had been studied by previous legislative councils of Montana, and then other states as well.
Other states
yeah,
too, yeah.
and professors or executive reorganization people who had interest that published their books and so forth. Did
And
some
you were
study
in
of
a
that.
particularly interesting area in that agriculture and livestock because I know Forrest Anderson, who was chairman of the commission, and said, "I don't want to get into a fight
Right.
with the cowboys." You know, basically.
Yeah.
And so, but you and tell us about the transition from there to the Constitutional Convention.
I really don't know.
Oh,
I mean, it was just kind of, I was surprised that I was the only one from the staff of executive
Right.
reorganization that transferred over to CONCON.
Eventually, Diana got there, but
Right,
but not in a
Diana, that's
research
true.
role. Diana
That's right,
Dowling, she
right.
was in a more of a legal role and a writing role.
Correct.
You moved over there, and then what do you do after the Constitutional Convention was over?
After the convention,
Right.
actually, I think this is the progression. I worked for the Secretary of State, and I guess my purpose there was to establish the filing system for the executive reorganization departments.
There was so much change that had to be
right,
properly
right.
filed for citizens to see.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then from there, I went to the Legislative Council.
So you worked at the council as a staffer.
As an indexer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you went from there. Who said to you, "Why don't you go to work for the Constitutional Convention"?
I
Do you
don't remember. I do not
Okay.
remember.
I wondered if it was Dale, if it was Ellis Waldron, or who might have said
Probably, I would think so. I think it was probably Waldron.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he had his fingers in a lot of that, and of course. Now, then you did the con. Did you go back to the council or
After, well,
after the
you
con was over?
I thought that's what you'd ask me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, after the con was over, I mean, reorg was over. You went into the council and con, or con and then council. I guess it doesn't matter. How many years were you at the council? Quite a few?
About 5, I think.
About 5.
Yeah.
Did you hang it up then, or did you?
No, well, I had children that were in school, and they were starting to get pretty active, and so for a year, I took a year off.
Oh.
I think it was in 1990. So yeah.
So now, you were assigned the executive branch article of the Constitution.
Right.
And most likely because you'd been involved in the executive before. You really knew what we had. And this is that report that we put out. Your name's on the inside of this, as is mine. A report that was given to the 1971 legislature.
Right.
And this is the summary. And then there was something about that thick for every department. So when you put them all together, there was a long thing of all these recommendations to reorganize the executive.
Right.
And that was interestingly done when we were doing the research for this. The question was on the ballot about should we have 20 departments?
20's plenty.
20's plenty it was called, yeah. And so the people, again, by about 65%, maybe 70%, voted in favor of 20's plenty. They said we want there to be instead of hundreds of different little departments and different little divisions and everything, we want there to be 20 departments.
Right.
20's plenty. And that's what the amendment did. And so while that was up for consideration by the voters, we did our research.
Right.
And we wrote this stuff, and when it went to the legislature, the people had already spoken. They said, there shall not be more than 20 departments.
Right.
And so, lo and behold, that was the very same legislature where they took up the Constitutional Convention issue, because that had been on the ballot too. So the 1970 ballot had executive reorganization on it, 20's plenty, and shall we have a convention? Right. And they both passed, and lo and behold, you ended up playing a role in the reorganization one. You had been, and now you were in the con doing reorganization, doing executive branch. Right. Tell us about the committee, if you recall, the people that you were working with. Do you recall?
The executive committee.
Yeah,
that was Tom Joyce was from Butte, was the chairman.
Right.
Let me see where. And Betty Babcock was a member. Richard Rader.
Oh yeah, Rader. He was Rader. Yeah. My history professor from Montana State.
Okay, and he'd been involved in some of the preparatory commissions or committees, commissions, convention, whatever. There were several. Margaret Warden from Great Falls.
Right.
Harold Arbanis from Great Falls.
He was a priest.
He was.
Yeah.
And so, and then James Garlington was vice chairman of the committee.
Attorney out of Missoula.
Right. And Archie Wilson from Hysham, and James Felt from Billings.
Former Speaker of the House.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
So he'd done the political rounds, but he couldn't be a legislator and be in the con though. He'd already stepped down as a legislator.
Right. And so he was able to run for con. And then Fred Martin from Livingston, who was a
newspaper editor.
Newspaper and
Interesting group. The whole group of them all 100 were very interesting.
Right.
Really.
Right.
Because they came from all walks of life, and we all benefit from that. So tell me about the committee. How did you guys go about, in a general way, trying to take and capture, because it had already been done substantially, but you still had to put it in a constitutional framework?
Well, and the amendment was in the Constitution. There was some discussion about whether in committee about whether or not that needed to be in the Constitution. Right. They did. It was continued in the new Constitution.
I'm guessing they might have been saying it would be politically inappropriate for us to take the 2020 thing out when they just voted on it overwhelmingly. Right. It might risk the Constitution if somebody wanted to attack it. Because remember, they were always looking to say, what if we did something here, would it make it less likely to pass?
That's
they
exactly
definitely
right.
wanted to have it pass.
Yeah, and that was the reason that some of the recommendations that were made by the preparatory commission were not even proposed to the convention. In committee, we had several hearings. I think we had 53 witnesses that we heard, mostly dealing with the varying boards and commissions and so forth and elected officials that were in the Constitution, that were in the '89 Constitution. So in the executive reorganization recommendations did not touch the constitutional officers or any of the
references,
boards or anything.
There was a couple boards or commissions that were referenced in the old Constitution. Livestock was one.
Right, and
the Agriculture Commissioner was referenced specifically. Labor Commissioner was in the old Constitution. What else?
Well, there were
constitutionally, I just want.
Well, there was
but they opted. They said.
This is something that executive reorganization said this needs to be considered by CONCON instead of us doing something. So there were two proposals submitted. There was a majority report and a minority report. The majority report retained some of the elected officials, but recommended that the state auditor and the state treasurer be eliminated. Archie Wilson and Betty Babcock submitted a minority report continuing all of the elected officials, the 7 elected officials. And immediately their proposal was accepted by the convention. Then later, when it got to the drafting committee, styling drafting, Rader proposed or called, asked for reconsideration, and at that time the state treasurer was
they kept the auditor, but they got rid of the treasurer.
Right, the constitutional status of the auditor, what they of the treasurer.
Treasurer still existed, but not as a constitutional officer.
And that was a big point, was that eliminating them from the Constitution didn't mean that it was eliminating the office itself, because it could be statutory. But that didn't carry.
But again, the keeping the elected officials was a tip of the hat, if you will, knowing that the electorate liked to vote on people.
That's exactly why. Yeah.
We take away the vote from a bunch of people, and we might lose this Constitution.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Oh, pragmatism.
Right. Well, and back in executive reorganization, it was pragmatism again that created. I mean, logically, agriculture and livestock might have been combined.
Could have been, maybe.
But given the the
politics
difference
of it,
the determination was made never even to recommend that.
So they were separate. And, And it was very interesting, but I think that kind of pragmatic approach carried forth even when they said, the majority of the con liked the unicameral legislature because they were unicameral.
Right.
They were one body. They didn't pass something and send it over to another house.
Right.
Hey, this is working pretty well.
Right.
Maybe we should have that. So most of them liked it, but they were smart enough to say, if we put that in the main constitution we ask people to vote on, they'll vote it down.
Right.
So they made it a side issue.
Right.
And it got beaten badly as a side issue. Yeah.
Oh, I think it. I don't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that and the other hot button issues they placed to the side. Again, pragmatism was really important, I think. They were idealistic,
Right.
but
right.
not
Idealistic but realistic as well.
Yeah.
I think the idealism came from staff, and then it was tempered a little bit by the delegates. Right.
having a strong governor. Now, one thing that before this Constitution of the old system, there was a governor, lieutenant governor, were both constitutional,
Right.
but they were elected separately. So what did you guys do?
Well, the recommendation from the staff was that they be a joint, run on a joint ticket.
Right.
And actually, Betty Babcock proposed that, and it was in both the majority and the
Okay.
minority reports,
Yeah.
and it carried the day.
Well, you know, there's some history about that. With Betty Babcock, her husband was the governor,
Right.
and he was having differences with James, who was the lieutenant governor, who was a Republican. But when Babcock went out of state, they'd been having a discussion about who ought to be on the Public Service Commission, and so Tim Babcock, the governor, left the state, and when he was gone, Ted James appointed Ernie Steele to the Public Service Commission, and so I'm sure that Betty was thinking of that when she says,
Right.
"I think we have these guys ought to run
Right,
together."
right,
And
yeah.
the same thing had happened when back at the time of W.A. Clark, there was a big fuss over that too. So you unified the governor and lieutenant governor.
Right. And that this business about being out of the state, I think the Constitution now says that the governor, just because he leaves the state, doesn't mean that the lieutenant governor takes over.
Yeah.
It's after, I think, 25
if
days.
he's going to leave a large number of days or something, there might be a transition.
Right.
Or he can assign and say, "I'm going to be gone. I'm going to let the lieutenant governor have my authority for
Right,
a while."
right.
But it doesn't. Not like the old days when they left the boundary of the state and the lieutenant governor had all the power.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you fixed that.
Right. Right.
And then so therefore, starting in 1976, was the first time a governor and lieutenant governor ran together. Yeah.
That's
Okay.
correct. Yeah.
Wow.
So-
Well, see the big difference.
Right. And some of the other things that actually almost all of the discussion, at least in committee of the whole on the floor, dealt with the difference between the majority report and the minority report, and didn't really. I mean, the majority report and the minority report on most of the rest of the things were identical, and the joint ticket was one. The executive budget was made mandatory in the new Constitution. It had been statutory before, but it now is
They wanted
a
to make
requirement.
sure that the executive branch produced a budget
Exactly.
for the legislature to consider.
Right. Right.
Sensible.
Right. And the veto power
Yeah.
was addressed. Previously, the governor, after the legislature adjourned, if the governor wasn't in favor of a bill, or was in favor, but politically
Didn't
there
want to
were
deal
some
with it.
right, he could just
They
leave it
call-
alone.
didn't they-
And that was called the pocket
The
veto.
pocket veto
The pocket
meant that-
veto, and that was
that-
eliminated.
So in the old Constitution, it required an affirmative signature of the governor, and if he left it alone, it would be vetoed. But if he left it alone, it wasn't passed, was it? It was a pocket veto.
I believe so.
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, so you instituted a new approach.
Yeah, now he was required to veto it or sign it.
Or sign it.
Right. And then we were also on the appropriation bills, and presumably others, that he was empowered to do line item vetoes, and also a mandatory veto,
right.
which, so he didn't just have to say no or yes, he didn't have to just sign it or veto it. He could send he could send the bill back to the legislature and say, okay, I have a problem with this, deal with it, and then the legislature would resubmit it to the governor, and the governor at that point then could sign the bill.
That really made it, actually the recognition of the complexities of government. That
exactly.
is, you pass it and it's up or down, and there's something wrong with it.
Yeah, just a little thing.
Yeah. So the governor could send it back upstairs and say, here's a fix I want you to do.
Right.
And most times, by the way, historically they tend to do it. If it's a super controversial bill, sometimes they'll have a fight.
Right.
And they'll send it back down and say, take it or leave it. And, then it becomes a...
The governor isn't able to amend it a second
again,
time.
That's correct,
right, Right.
Okay, so the veto power was changed, and the idea that the end of the session, there was veto issues there, that when the session ended, there were a certain number of days for a governor to consider a bill before, and then if he vetoed it, it had to go out within the legislative article, but in the veto language. If the governor after the session vetoed something, it would have to go out to the legislators for a poll.
Right.
Do you accept it or not?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So more flexibility on vetoes.
Right.
That came in awful handy when Brian Schweitzer was using a branding iron to veto a couple of bills.
For sure.
But so they had to do a budget.
Right.
That was a big deal. It's hard to envision, but in the 50 years, we've had one case where they went through the regular session and didn't have a budget in place. And now, also some things that I don't think they were the executive branch, but obviously the budget had to be balanced.
Right.
Under the Constitution as well. So what else under the executive? The
other thing that was somewhat significant, succession. That kind of was kind of up in the air, and the Constitution has quite a lengthy
kind of provision on
provision for succession. And it gets kind of down into the weeds a little bit, which
it kind of has to.
Right, exactly. And some of it was, because of what had happened within Montana, but also nationally with the U.S. president. Some of the disabilities. There were some provisions for if the governor is disabled, and and whether the lieutenant governor is acting governor or whether he's actually governor, there's quite a.
And then of course,
situation.
if the governor's, we'd had Governor Nutter killed in an airplane wreck in 1962 roughly, and our lieutenant governor took over, and under the old Constitution, the lieutenant governor remained empty.
Exactly.
And I presume that your
there was provision for there's vacancy and succession. There are two separate provisions in the executive article to address a vacancy, which was that situation, and then the succession was, if how it goes if there is a disability or something, and how the governor can re-exert his authority if he's determined not to be disabled anymore.
Now, on the floor, as you observed the process, They had a minority-majority report. And so again, where the primary disagreement was over the number of elected officials.
Right.
Describe the kind of nature of those debates, would you?
It was almost immediately. I mean, the Joyce moved the majority report, and I think it was Wilson moved the minority.
As a substitute motion, which put that one up for debate.
Pretty much, yeah. And it just it just kind of, there was no question there. Well, I mean, there were some questions, but it became apparent almost immediately that the elected officials would be continued on until then when Rader in March proposed, or that asked for reconsideration, and then the state treasurer was eliminated from the Constitution.
Yeah. Excuse me. The Public Service Commission is an elected office.
Right.
And it's a state-level elected office, although it's done by districts now.
Right.
At that time, it had historically been done statewide. There were 3 of them. And it was a statutory, I don't remember if it was constitutional in the old Constitution or not. Did you remove it from constitutionality, or did you just decide to leave it?
It was not in the executive article. That's what we dealt with. A lot of the other boards and commissions and some of that were removed from the Constitution were not done by the executive article, by the executive committee. That was, other committees like education, administration type people.
Yeah, education's kind of a hybrid,
Right,
It's
right.
But the PSC, which we still have, was a statutory body going in and stayed a statutory body.
I believe so. I'm not certain whether...
You don't remember anyone advocating the PSC be constitutional?
I don't recall that was the case.
Yeah.
But, so these were...
What other things did they take up in that article that you can... Anything else?
Well, I think that was pretty much it.
Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, in the executive committee, that is.
Right.
Yeah, it was, I think most of the concern was about the elected officials. And the rest of the things that we just talked about, the line item veto and succession and all of that, that was recommended, and not much was... there wasn't much debate over any of it. Jim, so Felt was not at the committee meetings when he had not signed on to the onto the minority report, but he was in support of it. He was not physically there. And so during the debates, committee of the whole, he proposed to give the state auditor real duties that, were already, some of them were already being performed, by the legislative.
So in other words, right now the auditor does insurance and securities.
Right.
But he wanted him to actually perform an audit function.
Yeah, he wanted, yes, yeah, and he was, and he spent at length. He had gone through it, but it was on the it hadn't been considered in committee because he wasn't there, and I don't know why. I can't remember that, but when he came and we were debating it on the floor, he presented it. And I think maybe that may have been one of the reasons that that his proposals were not advanced.
Well,
but the state auditor still remained.
The auditor remains, and that's really a name, not a function.
It is, and why? I'm not sure why they didn't change the name.
But it was right about that time that the legislature was developing an audit capacity for itself.
Right.
And I suspect there were some folks that said, let's let the legislature do this auditing, because then they're looking at the executive branch from an independent perspective.
Right, and as the Constitution was proposed or was submitted to the voters, there is a requirement for a post audit, that the legislature create a post audit. So that is in the Constitution, but not now, but not under the auspices of the state auditor. So.
Now, when we did reorganization, Governor Anderson, and again, a tip of the hat to the powers that be, if you will, chose to have a couple departments headed by boards,
right?
Which used to let's recall, prior to the 20s plenty, I think the ultimate number we ended up with was 188 boards, bureaus, and commissions that exercise executive authority, which is why we need to strengthen the governor. And but take livestock. The governor didn't want a livestock board was heading that department. And under reorganization, the governor said, I'm not going to fight him over that, and insist I have a single director. We'll have the director be elected or selected by the board, and the board's really the department head. It was the way it came out in reorganization. Were they recognized constitutionally? In the old days they were, but were they in the new Constitution?
Not livestock.
Okay, livestock was
the two boards that are constitution. Well, the two boards that were in the old Constitution that continued on into the second one was, or the departments, I should say. The Department of Agriculture is constitutional now, and the Department of Labor and Industry. And it is specified that it is headed, the Department of Labor and Industry is headed by a commissioner appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate now.
Right.
So those two departments are constitutional.
And you didn't specify that the head of the Department of Livestock was.
The Department of Livestock is no longer mentioned in the in the Constitution.
You said agriculture?
Agriculture.
Agriculture is okay.
Yeah. It's interesting.
So that then the statutory provisions adhered for livestock, which, by the way, to this day is kind of an awkward thing for any governor. Is they still have a board heading a department, which is not the standard, if you will.
Right. But they're not constitutional, however. Yeah.
And the Commissioner of Labor was constitutional and remained constitutional.
Right.
That came into play in 1980 when Ted Schwinden was elected governor. He'd been lieutenant governor, and he ran, and he was historically he ran against the governor he was running with. Tom Judge was running for a third term in 1980, and Ted ran against him and beat him. And that was after 12 years of Democratic governors. You had 4 years of Forrest Anderson, 8 years of Tom Judge, and Judge was running for another 4, and Ted, who'd been the lieutenant governor, for the first time running as a team, decided to run the next election for governor. He was elected, and so he actually replaced almost all the department directors, though he'd worked with them all. He'd replaced almost all of them, and when he came to replacing the Commissioner of Labor, he had to wait for the end of a term.
Right.
I think there's a term set for the Labor Commissioner, and he was not able to replace the Labor Commissioner immediately. He had to wait until that person's term was up, and then he could appoint him. But did all of those department heads require confirmation of the Senate the way you guys wrote it?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then only select the question of Senate confirmation for boards and stuff was pretty much a statutory issue, or was it in the Constitution? I don't.
I believe it's provided for. That it depends on. I may be confusing this with governor. If there's a vacancy in the department head,
Right.
In the first half of the governor's term,
Mm-hmm.
the governor can appoint
A new department.
the department head, subject to confirmation by the Senate.
The next legislature.
Right.
When they next come in.
Right. Right.
Okay.
So theoretically, well, that's in the second half, the second half of the term.
So they get
So
confirmed,
if
yeah.
there's a vacancy in a department head
Yeah.
in the second half of the term of the governor's term, he can appoint
Someone
and they serve
until a
until-
legislature happens to convene.
right.
If
right,
they have a special session, I believe he'd have to be presented to the
right,
special session.
Right. Yeah. The department heads need to be confirmed by the Senate.
Did the executive branch article, or was it the legislative article that contained the language about controlling the subject matter of special sessions? Because in the old Constitution, the governor only they couldn't come into special session
Right.
except when he called them in, and he told them you can take up this subject, and that's it.
Right. I think the legislative article provides for the legislature to call themselves back into session. The executive article provides that the governor can call them into special session, but it does not say anything about that he can specify that it's limited.
Now, the power of the governor to appoint judges when there are vacancies,
Right.
is that all articulated in the judicial article?
I believe so.
So it's not in executive article, okay? Because that, of course, comes to bear all the time.
Right.
So many judgeships are vacated, and then starts out with the appointment by a governor, and then they subsequently have to run for election. But that's all in the judicial article. A bone of contention these days, because of that Judicial Nominations Commission. That was kind of an interesting thing, even though it's not under your thought as a political thinker and a political scientist and a government specialist. When it came to the nomination of judges, the legislature or the Constitutional Convention said that the governor should make these appointments, and said, according to, they suggested a public process that involved that names would come to the governor and he would make the appointment.
Right.
By implication, and the legislature would set the rules for that. So by implication, there was a suggestion about a nominations commission. But in this last year,
Right.
there was a negating of that commission by the legislature, threw it out,
Right.
and said governor has more direct power on it. And I believe he's just informally using a advisory committee
Right.
type of approach, which goes to the question, the point that it's interesting when you leave discretion up to the legislature. It kind of makes sense from a constitutional perspective, because you don't want to have everything detailed in a constitution.
Right.
On the other hand, I've had a number of delegates say, "I wish we'd have been more specific." You know,
Yeah.
because you get a majority in the legislature, and you know, suddenly things are different.
Exactly.
Well, that's an interesting thing. If you were king, and of course we have
We don't want to be a king.
we have constitutions because we don't want kings, but if you had the dictatorial powers, is there anything you think should be done differently? Your personal preferences.
Well, I think maybe when I was a staff member, I probably would have promoted the short ballot.
Uh-huh.
But it didn't happen, and I'm not sure that there are many states that just have, you know, many of the other 49 states that they have just a governor, lieutenant governor, or some such situation as that.
Yeah.
I think that it just seems to be the pragmatic situation throughout all the states, that there's more than, you know, what theoretically everything should be concentrated. The executive should be a governor.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess maybe because I'm older, and I mean, I just don't think that would work. It might work, but I don't think that it would ever be approved by
getting the people
electorate.
to agree to it would be another issue.
Right.
You do have that interesting situation, for example, in the recent election, with all the controversy over secretaries of state and election denialism, that the question came up about important Secretary of State's elections in certain states where they were people have been worried about, would you have somebody, and they would say, well, we're not going to follow the vote.
Right.
We're going to change it. That's presidentially.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you looked at Pennsylvania, in that case, the governor appointed the Secretary of State. So there wasn't a big battle for Secretary of State in Pennsylvania, and Shapiro said, well, when they elected him overwhelmingly, they knew what kind of Secretary of State he'd appoint. But that was a case in point, I think, that some states do it differently.
Right.
Some states have, I think Wyoming has the Secretary of State and no lieutenant governor. And so if there's the Secretary of State would have sent to the governorship if they lost a governor. At least I kind of remember that. It was different than ours. So every state's a little different, but there's a national pattern almost.
Exactly. It seems to be.
Which is, by the way, different than the U.S. Constitution.
Right.
The U.S. Constitution says the president is it. And in all these departments, and the Attorney General and the people that take track of all these departments, they're all, there's no,
that is true.
They're all under a president. He's a super strong executive. States have avoided that. It's interesting. So in your youth, you would have maybe gone for that.
Well, yeah, I definitely went for that. I thought, you know, it should, I mean, the majority, I was disappointed in the majority proposal, because it did not just do the strong
It didn't go that strongly.
Yeah. I probably would have aligned myself with Rader, who had proposed that.
But again, there's that pragmatism that comes into play on that stuff.
Rader on the floor, several times said, "Well, I'm going to propose this, and you guys are going to vote against." It was kind of, I mean, essentially that's what he said. You know, it was,
He was quite a character.
Right.
Tell me of all give me a little bit of your evaluation of some of your reflections on some of the key con people that maybe made an impression on you, and what you thought about them as people doing this job.
Well, I guess mainly Rader. He was on my committee.
He was quite colorful.
He was sometimes. Well, and then and Kelleher, he was equally colorful.
Oh yeah.
Maybe in a different way.
Yeah. He was a little more off the beaten path.
Yeah, you didn't know for sure what he was going to propose or why.
He was unicameral.
Right.
But he'd also proposed that Montana have a navy, and we ought to dig a trench a canal from Montana to Lewiston, Idaho for shipping agricultural products, and a lot of other interesting things.
Yeah, he was a very interesting individual.
Yeah, and Rader was very colorful. Very, very smart guy.
Exactly.
And,
he was a bit more studious than Kelleher. Although
he taught me constitutional law, history. In Montana State.
Right.
It was a great course. I always admired him a great deal.
Sure.
How about others that stood out in your mind as delegates?
Well, of course, Maynan and Dorothy Eck.
The women.
Bugby, the women, of course.
Yeah. What an amazing 19 of them.
Right.
And there were only two, in the 71 legislature, there were only 2 women. There was Tony Rozelle, who'd been on our Reform Commission, and Dorothy Bradley. One in the House, one in the Senate, one Democrat, one Republican. And all of a sudden, bam, there were 19. And I understood from most everyone I've spoken to that every one of them had a great deal of influence. They really tried to make a difference, and they were real leaders in the CONCON.
Well, many of them were members of the League of Women Voters.
Yeah, 9 of them were,
and they had done many studies proposing constitutional revision. The League did, and they had pretty solid reasons for their positions.
Oh yeah.
Based on that.
Well, they made a world of difference, and I would say that from 0 in 1889 to 19, and those 19 made a lot of difference.
Exactly,
on it.
They did.
Tell me, as a young woman, how did you look upon that issue of women delegates and women playing an active role? Was it in the forefront of your mind at all?
Well, I was certainly pleased that we had that good a representation, and I was impressed obviously with their successes and their positions, how they stated them, and so forth. So it was kind of a supportive thing, I guess.
Yeah. Well, an interesting reflection of the changing times. And I mean, frankly, if you'd have gone far enough back, there would have not been women doing the research like you were doing. As a personal thing, what's your sense of we don't have 50-50 in the legislature, and we don't have 50-50 in the Congress. Women are still historically underrepresented. Have you thought about that in your as an active citizen?
Well, I think yes. There should be. We should make attempts to improve the representation, or to balance a better balance between male and female, or whatever in the legislature.
The question is the methodology. How do you do it? It's hard to compel it.
Right.
Well, we are getting close to the end, and let me thank you for being here. You are, as a young woman, made a mark on Montana history. That's why we wanted to have you come here and visit. You made a mark in reorganization. You made a mark in the Constitution. It's terrific that you were able to, put your intellect to work and your knowledge and your experience to work, helping shape Montana government. So, thank you for doing that.
No, thank you.
It's it's been 53 years, and it's always good to see you.
Thank you.
And for all of you who are enjoying Last Best Constitution, we want to ask you to continue to look for when it's available, broadcast, and keep in mind that you'll be able to stream it from a number of locations. So this information is going to be here for a long time. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.